me a little bit of time to first of all say we are recording this session. Okay, so we hope that we have your agreement. If not, please feel free to exit if you need to. Okay, so I just want to maybe briefly just share a couple of points about the Singapore Research Nexus. First and foremost, good morning and welcome to this workshop on new humanities and social science research on Singapore and the region. So for this event, we are pleased to feature 3 panels on Language and Multiculturalism, Religion and Place, and Diaspora and Cosmopolitanism. The presenters are faculty members of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at NUS. And if I'm mistaken at all, Rachel, please correct me. So we are very pleased to see a range of academics, policymakers, and postgraduate students and members of the public joining us today. In total, we received more than 170 registrations for this event, reflecting wide interest in research of relevance to Singapore. And I'm sure many more participants, attendees will be streaming in to join us throughout the course of the day. The SRN workshops, Singapore Research Nexus workshops, started in 2012. Okay, so a decade, and there have been 10 such workshops since. Some of the themes that have been addressed in past workshops include poverty in Singapore, aging in place, and creativity. So all themes of great relevance to changing trends in Singapore. You can also look out for events that the Singapore Research Nexus will be organizing in 2022. Of these, we'll be having a book launch in May 2022. The date will be confirmed at a later time. And this will be held at the Port National Library, at the National Library. And the topic is a book by Assistant Professor of Political Science, Alvin Ong. And the book is on opposing power, building opposition alliances in electoral autocracies. And apart from that, we have 2 other books that will be launched this year. The first is, the second book is by Associate Professor of Japanese Studies, Chris McMorran. And that is a book on mobilizing hospitality in rural Japan. And then subsequently in August, we will also have a book forum at the port for neighborhoods for the city in Pacific Asia. And this is by Associate Professor of Sociology, Ho Kong Chong. And subsequently in 2022, SRN will also hold another 3-panel event showcasing recent research in the humanities and social sciences on Singapore later on in the fall semester. So I just want to very briefly highlight that if you would like to have further news updates, there is a SRN workshop, website. You can also visit the SRN webpage, and I believe one of the research division admin staff will be posting the website and Facebook page in the chat box later. And these updates on our Facebook and website will include information on recent FASS research publications, faculty news, and grant-funded projects, all focusing on or of relevance to Singapore. We also want to highlight that the SRN publishes books. Here's the website and the Facebook page in the chat box now. So SRN also publishes books highlighting FASS researchers' grants that focus on Singapore. And if you're interested to get a copy of this book, please contact us at nexus@nus.edu.sg. And the email address is also in the chat box. So just a very brief introduction to SRN events. And before I conclude, I would like to thank the FASS Research Division staff, in particular Rachel, Debbie, Sis, for coordinating this workshop, and also the presenters and the chairs for making time to be part of this event before semester starts next week. And I shall now hand the time to Professor Bao Zhiming, who will be chairing the next session. Thank you very much. Over to you, Prof. Bao.
Okay, we are a bit early, but that's, hold on a second, let me, okay, yeah. So in the first panel, it's on language and multiculturalism, and with focus obviously on Singapore. So the 3 panelists are Professor Leng of Chinese Studies Department. She's an expert in contact features among Singaporean Chinese and especially Teochew. And I have seen one of her works on contact changes in Teochew language. So she will be talking about Singapore hawker centers, a linguistic landscape of identity, diversity, and continuity. You will probably hear a lot about Teochew Mui or something of that sort. But and then our next speaker is Nala, who is assistant professor in the English department, and she's an expert on Baba Malay. So she will be talking about on extreme outcomes of multilingualism, the case of Baba Malay, why Baba Malay is extreme or extremer than Singlish. We will need to listen to Nala to find out. And our last speaker on this panel is Rebecca, who is an associate professor also in the English department. She's a specialist in social phonetics, and she will be talking about third culture kids in the little red dot, children's social linguistic development and transnational mobility in Singapore. In other words, do you need to always sound like Singlish or not? But anyway, so what we'll do is for the speakers to finish their talks, and each will be given 20 minutes, and then and we'll open up for discussion. Okay, so now to you, Zhiming.
Am I on mute? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, sorry. Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about Singapore Hawker Centre, Linguistic Landscape of Identity, Diversity and Continuity. I think since most of us are attending from Singapore, everyone would be very familiar with Hawker Centre. But I'm fascinated, firstly, because of the language situation, and also because I'm a foodie myself. Okay, so here I go. All right. Okay, so just a little bit of background. We know that Singapore is made up of a large Chinese diaspora from southeast coast of China. So we have the largest community of dialect-speaking Chinese will be the Hokkiens, followed by the Teochews, Cantonese, Hakka, and Hainanese. I seem to be okay. And then we have Malay. And then we have the Indians, and we also have the Eurasians. I think we are all familiar with this, okay? All right, so next. So currently, we have the situation of about 75% of Chinese, followed by 14% Malay, Indian 9%, Eurasian and others. We're all familiar with the 4 official languages, Malay being the national language, and then we have Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, English, Tamil. And we know that English is now the medium of instruction, the main medium of instruction with L2, Malay, Mandarin Chinese, and Tamil. So this is so far for the background. All right. So we move on. Why hawker centers? It is a microcosm of Singapore society, and it actually mirrors the changing life and landscape over time. And I think it's so commonplace that we often don't pay attention to the linguistic landscape that is fascinating there. So because I'm from the Chinese department and I'm sensitive to the Chinese language as well, this is something that I enjoy doing. Okay, and I started this project in 2019 or so, excited that during that time, I didn't know that this is going to be nominated for the UNESCO representative list. And subsequently, in 2020, the hawker center culture was added to the UNESCO representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity. And I was very happy because I thought, oh, so it's something that I'm interested in and it's really recognized internationally. I looked up what this UNESCO representative list is about, and it says it awards to cultural practices and expressions that help demonstrate the diversity of this heritage and raise awareness about its importance. And PM Lee, when he mentioned Hawker Center being nominated, he also said that it is a cultural institution that shaped the Singaporean identity in many, many ways. We have like 6,000 cooked food hawkers at about 110 hawker centers all around the island. Straits Times, when it was nominated, mentioned that it provides Singapore with a sense of identity and continuity for people across generations in the context of urbanization. So I'm going to just look into this. Right? How I'm going to do it is firstly look at Singapore Hawker Center as a multilingual setting and focus on the variety of scripts representing the written traditions of English, Chinese, Malay, Indian, and Arabic. I have to confess that my interest is very much into the Chinese part of all these languages. I've yet to know more about Malay and Indian. So the research question of today's talk will be the extent to which these various written traditions are expressed and for what purposes. In other words, when we go into a hawker center, we just look at the signs, go order, and we sit down and we eat. If we look carefully at the signs, it tells us so much about our society. So that's what I'm going to do today, focusing on the signs. And to do this, I'm looking at language ecology. As Haugen mentioned, language functions in relating the users to one another and to nature, that is the social and natural environment. In other words, I'm looking at the interactions between the language in question and the society in which it functions. And Pennycook also mentioned that language ecology allows one to understand the relationship between language and what's called the environment. So in this case, I'm looking at the Singaporean language situation, the ecological relationship between the various languages, their written expressions, and the society at large. Okay. Also, because this is very much situated in the linguistic landscape framework, I'm going to mention that this is what I'm going to do also. It is, so for linguistic landscape, it is the language of public road signs, advertising, billboards, etc., to form the linguistic landscape of a given territory, region, or urban agglomeration. And Haupt mentioned that it is now an umbrella term for a wide range of perspectives that seek to make connections between language and environment. So we're going to look at how the signs, the languages in the sign reflect the environment of our society, the ecology of it. So in Singapore, what has been done, I think earlier on, this research has been done mostly on official or top-down regulations regarding the signs, the building names in Singapore, the signs of schools, road signs, street names, etc. Also public signs of MRT stations. And these scholars have found that English is prevalent, and even in the shop signs displayed in Singapore's neighborhood. Okay, what that has not been sufficiently looked at will be the coexistence of things like pinyin system and the non-Mandarin dialect spelling. Like, what is going on here? Why are these coexisting? So these issues are vital to understanding the ecology of the Chinese-speaking community in Singapore, besides all the other races. So LL, linguistic landscape, also reflects identity. So in Singapore context, food and hawker centers, we know, have become part of a national narrative and are intertwined with a national identity. So nobody in Singapore doesn't talk about food, okay? And eating is considered a favorite pastime, central to national identity. So hawker center signboards are all over. The important thing is that the heartland and hawker centers has less government intervention in terms of languages used. So if you go look at the signage, it is a mess, okay? And I'm looking at 114 hawker centers spread out among Singapore and the languages used on these signboards. What am I looking at? Firstly, number one, the languages on these signs reflect language used by everyday Singaporeans. They demonstrate the vitality of various languages in a multilingual society and show identity, diversity, and okay. So methodology, I'm looking at the 20 largest hawker centers, 114, so the total of 2145 hawker center signs. What do I analyze? So 90% of them are multilingual or bilingual, and only 10% just one language. I will look at the number of languages used, the Chinese script, which is traditional and simplified, and the non-Chinese scripts as well, which means there's the pinyin, the non-Mandarin dialect romanization, English names, Indian and Malay names. So these are the numbers. So we can tell that Chinatown Complex Food Center has the largest number of stalls, 226. And out of these, so this is it. And this is the spread out of the 20, mostly in the southern region, which is more vibrant in city. And if we look at the top 10 multilingual combinations, the highest number actually close to each other is simplified Chinese and English, and traditional Chinese, English, and NMD romanization. All right, so these are the most popular ones in terms of combination. And if we look at the multilingual signboards, in descending order, English is the favorite, which means that we have the highest number of signboards that has English in it. Okay, so so we are looking at the local trends, the important ecology of hawker centers, and because it is autonomous choices. Okay, so the first thing to look at is the monolingual signage. We only have 10%, but it tells us three things. The monolingual signage that has traditional scripts shows us that these are the earliest stalls that were set up. Okay, and the second simplified script shows us that most of these are immigrants in the 90s from China. And then the third one is a monolingual English to show us that these are new ecology of younger generations, and they sell non-Chinese food. So when I do this research, then only about 10% that are monolingual, and it tells us these three things in our ecology. All right. And the number of monolingual signboards, English is the highest, as I know. Okay. And so these are some of them. We have the English ones, European ones, and selling the Nyonya food and Thai food. So these are what I considered monolingual signboards, only 10%. Okay, next we look at the ecology of Chinese scripts. This is fascinating because before 1969, we used to use traditional scripts, and after about 76, simplified scripts was official. Yet in today's hawker centers, you will see a mixture of simplified and traditional. And this is fascinating because I don't think anywhere in the world has this combination. In mainland China, it's mainly simplified, a little bit of traditional, but in Taiwan it's traditional, but in Singapore it's a mixture of everything. Okay, so if we look at traditional script, we will look at a sign like that, and usually they inherit from parents, grandparents. Some of them like it because it's a fuller look and it's oldest, and it tells us the identity that they keep it that way, even though our official script now is simplified. They want to keep this tradition. And in simplified script, if we look at this, we will know that this is somebody probably immigrated in about the 90s or later. So, and sometimes it's because of the makers of the sign who tell them this is less complicated. So this is a simplified script. And then we mix them. So this is traditional script, and this is simplified script. So this is interesting because they want to keep the main name in traditional, but then when it comes to menu and description, they use the simplified. All right, this is very common now. And of course, we have other monolingual signs. And then the next one is bilingual signs. In terms of ecology, to reach a bigger clientele, reflects the language policy. English is the most prominent one. Of course, we have Malay, Tamil as well for diversity. So if we look at the English and Chinese signs, in this one, you will look at there's simplified Chinese, there's pinyin, that's food name. And then there's all selling chicken rice, but this one is traditional. It's a non-Mandarin dialect romanization plus food name. Okay, so we will see a mixture of these. So why are these coexisting, pinyin and dialect spelling? All right, firstly, these alphabets are to show the English part, even though it's not really English, all right? And the dialect spellings normally reflect the dialect identity, and the pinyin reflects the Mandarin speaking identity that follows the language policy. So these Chinese layers of dialect spelling, pinyin, traditional script, and simplified script have not coalesced. So this non-official language habitat preserved the old and the new. That's why it's so fascinating. So we know the Speak Mandarin campaign came upon in 1979, and because after that, dialect has been greatly reduced. So the dialect, the language ecology of the non-Mandarin dialects. Okay, we look at this because hawker centers. What's important in language ecology is that languages occupy specific functional niches or habitats within the environment. So we will find that in this specialized niche, in this important habitat, will dialect spelling are shown in two ways. Firstly, the food of the dialect group. Second, normalization of these dialect words. So each dialect has its own distinct identity, and outside Singapore, it's also very important, like Tian Tian Hainanese chicken rice is now awarded Michelin star, right? So auspicial characters like Heng Heng, which means lucky, is prominently featured in all our hawker centers. And yeah, okay, I don't want to go to this. So finally, why are all this mixture coming together? Traditional and simplified script, Spanish speaking and Pinyin. They show inflection points in language policies in our society, all right? And also the individual preferences. Some of them would prefer this because they want to keep the tradition of the parents, all right? And because we are given this freedom, it goes to show that what kind of identity they would like to keep, all right? And so these are the mixtures. If you can see here, this is traditional Chinese script plus English. Traditional Chinese script, and this is Ham Jing Bang. Doesn't make sense in English at all. It is the dialect pronunciation of Xian Jian Bing, all right? And then in this case, we'll see Bao Dian is traditional script, and Mai is in simplified version and plus Pinyin. So all this mixture tells us about our society, all right? And then other languages. So finally, we'll also find that in Newton Circus, you have something that has like 6 languages because it caters to tourists, all right? And finally, hybridity, okay. So hybridity comes because of contact in different culture and language ecology. It's seen in the stall names, food names, people, and Peranakans. I think we wait for Nala to talk about this. And hybrid food names, something I want to talk about, like Teochew satay bihun. Teochew doesn't have satay, so they maybe have bihun. So this is a hybrid food name, all right? And then in this case, Xiuji ikan bilis yong dao fu. This is in Hanyu Pinyin, this is in Malay, and this is in dialect. So this is a hybrid food sign that we see in Singapore, and especially in drinks, all right? So we have kopi, we have teh, meaning condensed milk. You know how we order all this. And then there's kosong in Malay, and there's ka siu tai in Cantonese, is gao and po in Hokkien, and halia in Malay. So if you string them together, you have Hokkien, Teochew, Hainanese, Malay. This is the hybrid drinks. So it shows our ecology in all these ways, in a monolingual, in Chinese scripts, in bilingual, in non-Mandarin, in a mixture of spelling and mixture of scripts and spelling, multilingual and hybrid. So the conclusion is that hawker center is really a niche contact that will show the old and the new, to show us the identity, the diversity, and the continuity. So the significance of this study is that in maintenance of linguistic diversity, this is really important. You contrast with food courts. This is in a Chinatown market selling duck stall. This is only say duck rice. This has got Chinese and everything else. The same for prawn noodle. So yeah, so this reference, and just want to thank you that it's important to preserve our identity, our diversity and continuity. Thank you very much. Oops. Stop share.
So we are early. Now, what is the rule? Do we just wait for a while, or should we continue? What's the general rule?
I was rushing and thinking that I'm late already. So
no, you are too early, because we started around 5 minutes early. That's the,
okay. So 20 minutes is 25. So 20 minutes after
10:25. You are supposed to talk until we are at 10:40.
Huh?
I think let's keep going, because I know my talk is going over time. So
you will go over time. Okay.
But I won't go over time if we start early.
Well, okay. So what about Nala? Do you want to go early or no? Continue.
I can choose to go anytime. Yeah, I'll just speak a little bit slower. I think
That's
doable.
that's a good thing, because
No, I
usually
speak very fast.
if we are like situation like this, we have to wait because people follow the schedules, right? So, but since this is online, we can be a little bit flexible. Okay.
I thought the talk is 20 minutes.
That's right. You took about 10 minutes.
Huh? This is 25 now, right? I started at 10:05.
We started early, about 5 minutes early. You talk for about 10, 15 minutes. So we are
Really?
we are
Okay, so I'm just rushing throughout. Okay.
Okay, no, it's all right. It's all right. We should. Okay.
Sorry.
Do you have more things to add? That's Leng.
Okay. Maybe I just go back since I'm like still early. Okay. 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 Let's. Okay. I must have like rushed everything. Okay. So I think what I wanted to stress on is that in fact, in the hawker center, you will find many mistakes in the way the characters are being written or English are being spelled. And I think this is wonderful because it reflects how the owners are dealing with the languages there. I think when the government comes in and intervene to standardize everything, we will not have this vitality, will not have this authenticity. So this is one thing that I observed. And I think the most important thing I wanted to say is that if we continue with this situation of just having duck rice instead of 经济潮州卤鸭 and 果汁 with the Chinese there and with the hybrid description, we will lose a lot of identity because somebody who puts a sign like that doesn't have ownership of what they're doing. Somebody who does this sign, we will make sure that this name has identity and has popularity to continue with the good food. So this is something that I wanted to point out. And one thing I didn't put on my slide is I think in 2017 or so, there was a big hoo-ha about NTU hawker canteen where they only have English names, right? And then there was a big write-up, and in the end, the president has to apologize that they didn't mean to do so, and they wanted to have a Chinese name. But we're looking at lots of food courts doing this now. I think the engineering side also has only English names on their stalls. So next time we pay attention to the stall names, we will see what has changed. And I think if the government want to continue this tradition or this diversity, this has to be looked into more seriously. Yeah, so that's, yeah, I think to conclude my talk, this will be it. Yeah, okay, I think I'm done.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Leng. Yeah, that's good. Now our next speaker is Dr. Nala Lee, and she'll be talking about the extreme outcomes of multilingualism. Nala.
Let me unmute myself first. I keep forgetting to do these things. Okay, so today we are, thanks to Ling for your talk. I think she contextualized the notion of the language ecology rather well. So it's basically about the kinds of languages that we see around us in the environment that might be competing for use or cooperating for use or otherwise. So, and this is going to be a relevant notion when we look at how Baba Malays change and evolve in the face of multilingualism. Okay, so we know multilingualism to bring about language change, anything from code switching to the borrowing of loanwords, to the borrowing of grammatical structures, and even to the creation of new languages when people who do not share the same language in common come to sustain contact with one another. So this is what happened in the case of Baba Malay, which was developed in a highly multilingual environment. So it's actually currently being threatened by other languages in its modern day multilingual context. But today, because I realized that I don't have as much time as I thought I do, we can only focus on one part of it. So we're going to be focusing not on its laws as much, but on its early days, on how speakers navigated that early multilingual environment, because I think much less is known about that. And we established that in the early days, there was actually a wide Baba Malay continuum, meaning that people most probably wrote and spoke Baba Malay in very different ways, given their individual multilingualism and stances towards the other languages in the environment. So what we do know is that in the 15th century, so for people who require a little bit more context, that Chinese traders traveled south based on the voyaging records for Admiral Zheng He, for example, who led trading exchanges in the South China Sea, Java Sea, and Malacca. So he also made some voyages to South Asia, Western Asia, and East Africa. But during that time, essentially, a soldier on one of his treasure ships by the name of Fei Xin wrote in Xing Cha Sheng Lan, the overall survey of the starcraft, that besides dark-skinned people, he had seen fairer-looking people of Chinese descent in Malacca, and this was in 1436. Then after a century or so, in 1537, there was another Chinese traveler by the name of Huang Zhong, and he wrote in his travel journal, Hai Yu, that the Chinese in Malacca ate pork, lived in hotels, and had female slaves to serve them food and drink. Well, these complement accounts that most Chinese men who came to trade did not return home and would have settled down with indigenous women, because it was rare for women to have traveled out of China similarly in those days. So most of these men were from Zhangzhou and Quanzhou, and they spoke Hokkien. So, and the women are postulated to have spoken some variety of Malay. So, and so Malacca flourished under the Portuguese rule as a trading port between 1511 and 1641 or so. Then the Dutch took over the Portuguese rule of Malacca in 1641, but they preferred using Batavia as a trading center, and they were keeping Malacca basically to prevent other powers from occupying it. So for more economic opportunities, you had great numbers of Peranakans moving from Malacca to Penang when it was established as a port, trading port. And then when the British established an even newer port in Singapore in 1819, more Peranakans moved to Singapore. So it's curious because we know that the Peranakans in Penang don't speak Baba Malay, they speak a version of Penang Hokkien. But so we are focusing more on Baba Malay in this talk. So to sum up very quickly, the hybridity of the straight Chinese, the late president of the Peranakan Association Singapore once provided me this analogy. He thought that the culture was very much like itik dim. So you may or may not know the dish. You may know the dish as yam cai ak, which is basically duck soup with salted vegetables in it. So he said, well, it comprises the Chinese preserved vegetables, the Southeast Asian tamarind, and Western brandy, among other ingredients. And this is pretty much what the culture essentially is like. So a few pictures of the culture. So it's basically a mishmash of Chinese and indigenous characteristics as well as Western ones. A mishmash of cultures as you expect of a Creole culture, that's a fusion of different characteristics. You can see how the dressing style, it's a blend of different styles. This is a picture from the 1930s. And you can see the woman is wearing a baju panjang, a long style top with a sarong, and the man is dressed in the Western style. So these happen to be my great-grandmother and my step-great-grandfather, but you can see very blended kind of way of dressing, very hybridized. And in the next picture, you have small kabaya tops and sarong, so kabaya being a shorter blouse. So these can clearly be contextualized locally, but the main motifs on them are usually Chinese ones, such as peach blossoms, crabs, dragons, and so on and so forth. And then you have the karosang, so the three brooches that are linked by a chain that we use to pin up our tops. And this you can see in the earlier fashion of the region by other people as well, not necessarily just the Peranakans Chinese. And then you see a picture of the NUS Baba house on the bottom left picture. So importantly, it features what we call a jiho, which is a panel with Chinese words on it. It's usually a Chinese crest, a family name or a motto. And then we go to the next picture. It's a picture of the Kasut Manik. So over here, this is both Western and Chinese culture, because we can see Western beads being used. These were basically checked beads that were brought in, but you can see the design on it is clearly kind of Chinese in nature. Then, crucially, of importance to us, we have the Cerita Dulu Kala, stories from long ago, which are usually translations of Chinese classics like Eight Immortals, Water Margin, Feng Shen Bang, etc. So these books were published in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So this provides an important crux for today's talk. And so before we begin to look at the language data proper, it's useful to look at the socio-historical context of the Peranakan Chinese, who were an influential class of capitalists. They were among the first in the region to receive an English medium education, which enabled them to prosper in trade and commerce. And they were also valued mediators who mediated between the British administration and the Chinese newcomers to the region, people called Singapore. So what people generally think is that the Peranakans identified very much with being British. They identified with being the King's Chinese, the Queen's Chinese. But the truth is that the situation was much, much more nuanced than that. Before English schools were set up in the region, some Peranakans had sent their sons to China for education because there was no other choice, educationally speaking. Then there were also Peranakans who saw the need to identify themselves as being culturally Chinese. They recognized that there was an influx of influential Chinese immigrants whose numbers were far outpacing theirs. Chinese languages, especially Hokkien, was becoming increasingly important. Then there was that kickback, or that because of the what happened with the first Sino-Japanese War, the nationalist movement happened as well as the reform movement, and this kind of caused the Chinese Peranakans to reconsider their allegiance. So this was found in the Straits Chinese magazine in 1907. So this writer said, "We Straits Chinese fathers should therefore encourage our girls in every possible way to give up the Malay language and revert to the Chinese tongue." Then there were others who rejected this sort of clarion call. So conversely, the editor of the Malacca Guardian said in 1929, "Malay is not part of China, and the language of this country is either English or Malay. And most of the Straits-born Chinese are content to learn well those languages." So you can see kind of different stances that people had towards the kind of languages that they found in the environment. So very quickly, moving on from there, this is what's happened current day. It's considered to be severely endangered, as you see from this screenshot that I've taken from the Endangered Languages Project. So while within community marriages were once popular, they became rare post-World War II. Intermarriages between Chinese and locals no longer result in the Peranakan cultural identity. In Singapore, the Peranakans were also, because they were first in the region to adopt English medium education following up the setting up of British English medium education schools, and thus English spread very quickly into home domains. It's still used as a very dominant language with friends and family. And then in Malacca, we have Peranakans who are exposed to Malay. So today we estimate there to be about less than 1,000 speakers in Malacca, less than 1,000 speakers in Singapore. If there are any monolingual speakers left at all, they would be at least in their 90s. So in 2014, when I interviewed speakers in their 90s, like the oldest woman people I managed to find who were monolingual were 94 and 97. So you can see how, whether or not you can postulate if there might still be monolingual speakers. So most speakers are at least 50 and above. Language can be considered to be highly moribund with little to no intergenerational transmission. So just for some backgrounding, in response to Baba Malay's endangerment, I developed a reference grammar of the language for my PhD. So if you're interested, an updated version is slated to appear in print next month. So one of the feedback that I've always received from other Creolists was that they found it interesting that the language is so fixed that it could be encapsulated in grammatical descriptions that says that the language has features X, Y, and Z, rather than the language has features X, Y, and maybe Z. So it's interesting for Creoles in particular, since Creoles evolve in highly multilingual environments and are usually highly variable in form. They are usually formed when people who speak different languages come into sustained contact with one another, usually for very functional purposes. And they contain the languages spoken by these people. There's usually a language that provides most of the grammar. We call that the substrate language. Then there's another that provides most of the lexicon, called that the lexifier language over here. And Creoles are usually marked by continuums with individual productions ranging from more substratal to more lexifier-like. So this is what makes the notion of a very static entity surprising. So, and in this talk, I show that it wasn't always so. So have to talk a little bit faster. But for now, the notion of a Creole continuum is a useful one to explore. So the notion came about when researchers such as Cam came to the realization that there wasn't necessarily always a very sharp cleavage between Creoles and standard Englishes, but rather a continuum of various types of speech. And he was really looking at the Jamaican Creole. Then later on, the notion that this variation stems out of ignorance of the other group's preferred variant was squashed. So it's not as though people don't know what the standard is, but rather they found value in preferring one variant over the other. And this is usually tied to the notion of identity alignment. So acts of identity, for example, can be thought of as speech acts that reveal the speaker's sense of social and ethnic solidarity or difference, following Page and Terrett Keller. So for some semblance of the Creole continuum, we can begin to look at variability in early Baba Malay. So Thurgood in her 1998 dissertation wrote a dissertation based on the early material she found from the late 1800s and early 1900s. This showed a great deal of variability in her description. You would note that there was always a range of structures that were permissible for certain functions. For example, while her data showed predominant classifier, phrase, head, noun, word order, she also showed data in the other direction. So it becomes rather clear that there was a wide range of variation that existed in early Baba Malay if we compare this to the modern data. So this is basically what we're trying to say, that there's a Creole continuum exists. It's a spectrum between the lexifier and the substrate language. In this case, a spectrum between Malay and Hokkien, and that the individual's multilingualism or what manifests on the Creole continuum very differently. So it was a much more varied language than we currently think it is. Okay, so this is my data. So we managed to collect a corpus of early texts dating from 1892 to 1931. We have texts that are based on Cerita Dulu Kala because there's so many of them. But the problem with using written genre, of course, is that, you know, it seems to be perhaps a very specific kind of genre. So we mix this up with fan letters. So very interesting, because the Cerita Dulu Kala was so popular that people wrote the author's fan letters and they would append this to the start of the stories. So so you see how this was used. So this came up to about 65,000 words or so, and this offers us a very rare glimpse into the early form of Baba Malay. So just very quickly, some examples for you to look at. So this is variation along a continuum. This is variation towards Hokkien. You can see various things like this happening. So Kongsu punya ajaran Gosu. So this is a very strange use of the word story, because elsewhere in the current Baba Malay, you see the word cerita. This is a one time of use of the word Gosu, for example. And you can see that the author has actually appended like the Chinese characters after the Romanization as well. Then in the other one, you see Bonaiho as expressing no alternative. So these are clearly very Hokkien examples. And then you can see variation in the other direction as well. So see, here we see variation due to Malay. For example, we see aku being used for first person singular. Elsewhere in Old Baba Malay and in current Baba Malay, you'd see saya and gua being used, but no longer aku. And if you ask speakers today what they think of aku, they tell you it is very Malay. So similarly, in the early data, you see ibu being used to mean mother, ibu coming from Malay. Elsewhere in the early data and in current Baba Malay, the more common Hokkien forms that you find are mak, nio, nia, etc. Ibu is no longer used. So, and of course, because English was such a dominant trait in the environment at the time, given how quickly the Peranakans adopted English, you can see this occurring in the writing as well. So, my dear Sobat Batu Gantong, for example. And then in this novel, this is interesting because this is Si Jing Gui, if you know the novel. So this is supposed to be a Chinese classic novel, and the author just basically transplanted the word meeting there, when there are other ways of saying perhaps meeting. Ada meeting pasal negeri, so there's a meaning about the matters of the country. So you can see it's going in several directions over here. there's also morphosyntactic variation. So this is just one example because I don't have time to show all my data. So in modern Baba Malay, ter seems to imply uncontrolled movement. So you can actually fall down, sit on your bum. So dia terduduk. But in Old Baba Malay, it had other meanings as well. So it could be used for the superlative. So Leo dengan ter sedih, he was extremely sad in his heart, for example. And it could also be used for to imply the passive as well. So the tense was set up, for example. Okay, let's see. So basically, what this shows is that just looking at one ter form alone, you can see that it was used to varying degrees by various writers with varying meanings. Some use it to imply the passive, others use it as an uncontrolled movement marker as well as the superlative marker as well. But at that time, there was also a different passive, one that still survives on to today. So this is the different passive. So we know in English kena, right? So this is similarly that passive that you see. So the passive, there seems to be an equivalent in Hokkien. So this is tiok that you see. And Lim, 1988, was writing about the Baba Malay that he saw in Malacca. And he said that, perhaps because kena and tiok share a similar meaning lexically, to strike or to hit, that the passive meaning for Hokkien tiok was also transferred into kena as well. So then you would think of the ter passive form as being rather Malay and this kena passive form as being more Hokkien in nature. So you can see different forms competing for use then. We found about 8 tokens of passive ter and 106 tokens of kena. So, but basically what's important is that there was a lot of variability in how much or how little Baba Malay detracted to either ends of the continuum. Okay. So if you're interested in looking at more examples, I'm currently revising this paper. It should appear in print sometime this year. What the findings go to show is that using written resources that pretty much represented the heydays of Baba Malay, it's possible to see that Baba Malay was much more variable in the past than it is right now. Well, this is not to imply that early writers were deliberately choosing their features to represent their stances towards the languages in their multilingual environment. Rather, that the socio-historical context of the late 1800s and early 1900s meant that there were many competing pressures, and that Malay, Hokkien, and English were all dominant and present in some form in Baba Malay's ecology, leading to extensive variation within that continuum and outside of it. So I hope to show you that it's much more dynamic than we thought it was, and that we've established that there was an early Baba Malay continuum. So the other question which naturally follows is, why is there much less variability today in the Baba Malay that we see? And my sense is that this has a lot to do with language endangerment, but that would be a separate paper altogether. So, and if you're curious and interested, the books that you see were published mainly in Singapore. So there were Cerita Dulu Kala published in Indonesia as well, but that represents a separate language altogether. The Peranakan Indonesian is a separate beast altogether, but there were actually no Cerita Dulu Kala published in Malaysia, which is very interesting. But most of it was actually, all of it was actually published in Singapore. So this kind of represents that variety, I guess. Okay, I don't know if I went too fast or too slow because I lost track of time. But that's about all that I have right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Nara. You still are within your time. I thought you could go 10 more minutes, but anyway, so that's very nice of you to not use up the time. Okay, now our next speaker is Rebecca, talking about how children, I think, acquire their sense of identity, social identity. Rebecca?
Hi,
You
thanks so
have
much for
30
inviting me
minutes.
to talk today.
You have 30 minutes.
Today I'll be sharing some of the work I've been doing on children's sociolinguistic development and transnational mobility here in Singapore. Today we'll be talking about children's development in Singapore, and we'll be looking both at children who are Singaporean citizens and who have grown up in Singapore, and those children whose parents have moved to Singapore to work and who are growing up in Singapore as expatriates or expats. In the sociological literature, these children have been dubbed third culture kids. This term refers to the three cultural spheres that children encounter: the culture of their parents' home country, the culture of their present residence, in this case Singapore, and the transnational hybrid expatriate culture, which is the so-called third culture. So, what are the implications for language use and the sociolinguistic development of expat children? And are there certain ways in which expatriate children are distinct from conventional second dialect learners who move to a new community and learn the dialect? Now, although traditional work on expatriate children exclusively examines those children, in a situation like Singapore, where there's a lot of interaction between expatriate children and so-called local children, we can consider the proposal that expats are not the only third culture kids, but local children are also exposed to a complex array of intersecting indigenous and migrant cultures. So, in Singapore and in other transnational migration settings, to what extent do expatriate children and local children share sociolinguistic norms? So today we'll be looking at English in Singapore, and as you probably know, English has recently become the most commonly spoken home language in the country. And while English is now widely spoken as a native language, ideologically speaking, it's still positioned as an outer circle non-native English in the sense that it lacks a perceived legitimacy that is ascribed to inner circle varieties such as US, UK, and Australian English. In terms of Schneider's dynamic model of post-colonial Englishes, Singapore has been placed in the phase of endonormative stabilization. This means that it's in the process of shifting towards full acceptance of local English norms. This project focuses on the notion of transnational migration, and of course in Singapore there are many transnational migrants. Singapore has attracted migrants across the socioeconomic spectrum in recent decades, and at the moment about 21% of the higher skilled and 43% of the lower skilled labor is foreign. And those immigrants who earn above a certain salary are permitted to bring children to Singapore, so these are the so-called expat kids. Historically, these sorts of children used to attend primarily international schools, such as the Singapore American School. And while some children still do attend international schools, many of these expat kids now attend local government schools, as the international reputation of Singapore schools has increased, and the cost of international school has also increased. So due to increasing transnational migration in Singapore, children growing up here are exposed to a range of English varieties in their daily lives. So what I've been investigating in my work is how does children's interpretation of this complex landscape shape their language use patterns, and how do the sociolinguistic patterns of local and expatriate children and those attending local schools versus international schools differ. So today I'll be presenting a few of the results from my ongoing project, Voices of Children in Singapore, or VOX. This is an ongoing project looking at the sociolinguistic knowledge and language use of local and expat children ages 5 to 19. There are 117 participants in total at the moment. This project includes both perception and production tasks in both Mandarin and English, but today we're going to be focusing on English and considering how performance on English social evaluation tasks correlates with English production. So first I'll touch on some of the social evaluation tasks that we carried out with our participants. Participants completed several tasks, assessing their familiarity with and evaluation of various dialects of English. And if you'd like to know more about that, you can see my findings in Starr et al. 2017. But crucially for today, participants rated the likelihood that talkers from various regions were English teachers, coffee shop workers, or maids. And in this task, I'd like to highlight the findings of Australian versus Singaporean talker ratings for English teacher. So here in the blue bars, we have Australian English speakers, and then in the green bars, we have Singapore English speakers. And the rater groups here are children of different backgrounds. So here we have Singaporean children who attend local schools, we have expatriate children who attend local schools, and expatriate children who attend international schools. And the higher bars here indicate that the child said, yes, the speaker is likely to be an English teacher. Okay, so what we see here is that across all three groups, even the students in local schools where the majority of teachers are Singaporean, the children all believed that the Australian English speaker was far more likely to be an English teacher than the Singaporean teacher, even though there are few, if any, Australian English speakers who work as English teachers in local schools. What's also notable here is that if we compare the expatriate children in local and international schools, we see that they are just as likely, or rather unlikely, to think that the Singaporean English speaker is an English teacher. So there's not really much of a difference between these two groups. So what we see here is some mixed ratings for Singapore English speakers. And we can operationalize this with the proposal that children who believe Singapore English talkers are likely to be English teachers, we can attribute to them a higher endonormative orientation towards Singapore English. So we predict then that these children are going to use more Singapore English features in their own speech than those children who felt that the Singapore English talkers were not English teachers. Another aspect of the project that we can operationalize here, as part of the data collection session, children were interviewed and they were asked whether they believe that they spoke English with an accent. So for those Singaporean children who believe they do not have an accent, these are going to be the ones we propose have a higher endonormative orientation towards Singapore English. And again, we predict that these children are going to be using more Singapore English features in their own speech. All right, so moving on then to the production analysis where we're going to test these hypotheses. We have data from 60 of the participants analyzed. We have 20 Singaporean children in local school, 20 expats in local school, and 20 expats in international school. In terms of where the expats come from, they have a very wide range of complex backgrounds. Many of them were born in one place but hold a passport for a different country, and they have parents from 2 different countries, and so on. For the production tasks, we had participants read aloud 2 short stories, and these were passages that I wrote designed to include phonological features of Singapore English. The participants were also interviewed about their daily life, their hobbies, and language attitudes, and these were all conducted by Singaporean interviewers. So the linguistic variable we're going to look at today is word final TD deletion in consonant clusters. So this is the deletion of a T or D when it occurs at the end of a word in words like past, so that would be pronounced as pass. This is one of the most well-studied variables in sociolinguistics across many different dialects of English, and we know from previous work that there commonly across communities we find phonological environment effects. We also have morphological environment effects, and specifically the effect that's often found is that monomorphemic words, such as past, in which this is all a single morpheme or meaning unit, the T and D is much more likely to be deleted here, versus these irregular past tense forms, which are also called semi-weak forms, such as lost. And then the least likely to be deleted is regular past tense ED. So this type of past in which you would delete the T here. So in terms of how common TD deletion is in other dialects, the deletion rate in British English is 24%, and you get a comparable amount in US English as well. However, in previous work on Singapore English is characterized by a very high rate of T deletion. So for example, Gut 2007 finds a deletion rate of 84.8%, and this is among university students in spontaneous speech. So we might expect non-university educated speakers to have an even higher rate of deletion. What's also surprising about her findings is that she finds it doesn't pattern very typically in terms of how it relates to other dialects of English. So in terms of phonological environment, it doesn't show any phonological conditioning. There's also no effect of morphological environment. So generally speaking, this looks very different from the TD deletion that we see in other varieties like British English. So in this analysis, we're going to consider a few factors in our statistical model. We're going to incorporate random effects of participant and lexical items. So this will be a mixed effects analysis. And we have some internal linguistic effects. We will be looking at whether it's a T or a D potentially being deleted. We'll look at morphological structure, so monomorphemic versus semi-weak versus regular past, as we talked about a moment ago. And we'll also look at the preceding and following segment, meaning the sound. And then we'll look at quite a few external social effects. So these are effects that relate to the background of the speaker. This will include, we will divide the participants into the 3 background groups: Sing Local, Expat International, referring to their national background and school attendance. And then we have a few ways of capturing how long they've been in Singapore, including age of arrival, whether they were born in Singapore, the time lived in Singapore. We have the circle of English in which they were born, gender, age, and then we have the ratings that we talked about before. So first of all, we have whether they can identify Singapore English in a region identification task. We have whether they rated Singapore English speakers as likely to be teachers, and we have whether they believe that they have an accent. So these are the attitudinal factors that we discussed earlier. So first, let's just take a listen to how the children sound. First, we have a local Singaporean student, and this is just a bit of the reading passage. I've highlighted the TD potential deletion context in red here.
To visit his friend who lived in a city far away.
All right, and then we have his interview excerpt here.
We went to many different provinces.
Okay, so again, we have 100% deletion in this case. All right, now we have an expatriate who is attending local school.
To visit his friend who lived in a city far away.
Okay, and now we have his spontaneous interview in which he's talking about Minecraft.
Minecraft, I like the concept of it being a big sandbox game. You can create anything you can out of whatever you want.
All right, so in this case with these excerpts, he has 100% retained TT. All right, so here is a box plot looking at the overall findings. So here we have our 2 different styles. We have the spontaneous interview speech in the darker gray and the red speech in the lighter gray. And we have our 3 groups we're looking at: Sing Local, Expat Local, and Expat International. So first of all, focusing on the Sing Local. So these are Singaporean children attending local schools. So if we look at their spontaneous speech, overall, they are deleting in spontaneous speech at a rate of about 76.2%. That's a bit lower than Goot found with her university students, but it's still up there pretty high. And we see a gap between the reading and spontaneous speech. So we have less deletion in the red speech. So if we jump over to the right here, the expatriates attending international school. So here's the spontaneous interview speech, and here's the red speech. We see not as much of a gap here as we saw with the Singaporean local students here. But we see the rate of deletion is much, much lower. Again, if we compare this with British English, where the average deletion was about 24%, we see this is about where that is. And then moving to the middle, the expatriate students attending local schools, we see an interesting pattern. So here we have the spontaneous interview speech, and here we have the red speech. And what we see in the interview speech is a bimodal pattern, by which we mean most of the students in this group are deleting at a relatively low rate, like the expatriates in international school, but we do have a minority of these students who are deleting at a higher rate, more comparable to the Singaporean students in local schools. On the other hand, if we look at the red speech distribution looks pretty much exactly like we get for the expats in international school. All right, so sticking this into a generalized linear mixed effects model, I'm not going to bore you with the details of these statistics, but we're going to run 4 models here. First, we're going to run something with all the participants, and then we're going to break it down by group. So here, the positive z-values indicate more TD deletion. All right, so we have significant main effects for background group. So we have all of these background groups significantly different from each other, with Sing Local deleting the most, and then Expat Local, and then Expat International. We also have significant main effects for the following environment. Then in terms of morphology, again, we see a finding consistent with previous research, where monomorphemic words like past PAST are more likely to delete, while semi-weak and regular past tense is less likely to delete. And then we have a significant difference by style, with spontaneous interview speech more likely to delete than reading. And we also have a significant interaction of background and style, because as we saw, the expat international students don't have as big a difference in their interview versus read speech as the other 2 groups. So interestingly here, when we look at these significant factors in the overall group of participants, we don't see any significant effects of our attitudinal or familiarity factors. So regardless of how all of these students feel about Singapore English speakers and Singapore English, that doesn't seem to affect their use here. But let's break this down by student background group. So here we have an analysis just looking at the Singaporean participant. So again, positive z-value here equals more TD deletion, although these are all negative. So the negative z-value here means less TD deletion. So what we see here when we break down these morphological categories, we have semi-weak verbs patterning with monomorphemic words here versus regular past tense ed, where they pattern significantly differently. All right, and we have the same effects for following environment and style as the overall model. But here, when we look at the attitudinal factors, we find that things are consistent with what we predicted. Specifically, those who rate Singapore English speakers as likely to be English teachers, they indeed have higher rates of deletion. And those who do not believe that they have an accent also have higher rates of deletion. So again, this is consistent with what we predicted would happen. Now let's take a look at the expat local participants. Okay, so in contrast to the Sing local group, we see a different internal patterning of the morphological effects in which semi-weak is patterning with regular past tense. And I should note that this is more consistent with what's been found in other varieties of English. Then what we see here is that there's no significant effect of attitudinal effects here. So regardless of whether these expatriates in local schools believe that Singapore English speakers could be English teachers, right? And regardless of whether they think that they have an accent, that doesn't have any effect on their TD deletion rate. But what we do see here is an effect of birthplace, with those who are born in Singapore using more deletion, which is perhaps not surprising. They've spent more time in Singapore and therefore their speech is more Singapore English-like. However, if we compare that with the expat international participants, we see some interesting differences here. So here we see, in terms of morphological effects, the expat international group is patterning with the expat local group, and again, more similarly to other varieties of English, where semi-weak is patterning with regular past tense verbs. What we have here is a gender effect, which is also consistent with other varieties of English, with male participants more likely to delete. And this was not an effect that we saw among the other two groups. And unsurprisingly, based on our box plots, unlike the other two groups, we have no significant style effect for the expat international participants. And crucially, while the expat local group, as we saw here, there was a significant effect of birthplace. However, among the expats in international schools, there's no impact of being born in Singapore. Even those expats who are born in Singapore, they are not deleting TD any more than those who are not born in Singapore. And here we have no attitudinal effects. There's no effects of believing that Singapore English speakers could be English teachers or accent self-perception. So in terms of key findings, let's turn first to the Singaporean participants. So we have a bit of contrast here with GOOT 2007, where we see a slightly lower deletion rate, and we also see some internal linguistic factors that are patterning. They're looking a bit more like other varieties of English than before. We have more phonological effects, and we also have speakers showing a dispreference for deleting in regular past tense ed, whereas GOOT didn't find any effect of that nature. So this is perhaps due to increased contact with other varieties of English. However, the overall constraints and deletion rates still look very different from UK and US English. We also see that, as we predicted, those who believe they do not have an accent and that Singaporeans are likely to be English teachers use more deletion. So this suggests a crucial impact of rising endonormativity, as proposed by Schneider, and underscores the importance of contact with non-local accents. So are Singaporean children being influenced by contact? So if we compare what we found in our work, and we compare it with work from the 90s in terms of younger Singaporeans' awareness of non-local varieties of English, what we see is a dramatic rise in awareness of other dialects of English. In Starr et al. 2017, for example, we found that by the age of 8, over 90% of Singaporean children that we tested can explicitly identify Australian English. And when we look at what the students had to say in the interviews, we see this effect as well. So, for example, when we asked this student why he thinks he doesn't have a typical Singaporean accent, he had this to say.
I'm exposed to so much Western media and like English shows and American TV, and so I'm influenced by that.
And when we ask students if they know anyone who has an accent, we see a lot of responses that yes, children do know other children who have accents.
I have a friend who has a very American accent, like Southern accent, because he lived in America for a very long time. I have a friend who has a British accent. He went to the UK for 3 months and he came back with an accent, and he refuses to get rid of it.
All right, so what we can see from this is that younger Singaporeans do indeed have quite a bit of contact with non-local accents, and this can perhaps explain why we're seeing some changes in the patterning of TD deletion. All right, moving on then to the expatriate participants. What we see is that the expatriates in international schools have significantly lower rates of TD deletion than expats in local schools. And in fact, those students who attend international schools, their rates are looking very comparable to those rates used by speakers in inner circle countries like the UK and US. And interestingly, what we observed among the expats in local schools was a bimodal pattern, where you have some students who seem to be absorbing local patterns for spontaneous speech, but most students not acquiring these local patterns. What we also saw among the expatriate participants was no impact of attitudes, accent self-perception, or Singapore English accent familiarity among these students. So it's quite interesting why this is the case, and I'll be returning to that in just a minute. What we also see is that while expats in local schools show a higher rate of deletion if they were born in Singapore, there is no effect of birthplace or time in Singapore or age of arrival, anything like that, for expats in international schools. So why is it the case that expats in local schools are not sounding more Singaporean? So some possible factors discouraging expat adoption of TD deletion. First, we have a continued perceived status of Singapore English as a non-native variety that children are implicitly discouraged from acquiring. And then we have a slightly different reason, which is the perceived status of Singapore English as an in-group variety that cannot be authentically adopted by outsiders. So this second factor may account for why even those expats who rate Singapore English talkers as English teachers, they're still not more likely to adopt high deletion rates. So they may feel that Singapore English is a legitimate variety of English, but it's not one that they can authentically adopt themselves. So this also accounts for why we see a significant effect of birthplace among expats in local schools. Those expats who are born in Singapore may be much more likely to take on a local identity than those who are not born in Singapore. So if we listen to what the expat children have to say about Singapore English, we can see perpetuated here ideologies that delegitimize Singapore English.
No, because I've learned how to speak Singlish and I talk to my friends and dad. But at home, I speak properly.
All right, so some conclusions from this work. We see that TD deletion rates of Singaporean children show some signs of change due to contact and perhaps due to fluctuating attitudes towards Singapore English as a legitimate English variety. We also observe that the sociolinguistic patterns of expat children are shaped by interaction of school type and birthplace, but not by attitude towards Singapore English. So adoption of local features by expats may be limited due to ideological factors regarding the legitimacy of Singapore English and its status as an in-group variety. All right, just some note on further ongoing work. I have quite a bit more work in the same project. For example, I have a corresponding analysis of Mandarin perception and production data that I don't have time to talk about today, unfortunately. And currently for this project, we are starting to investigate additional children who have come to Singapore from China, India, and the Philippines, with the hypothesis that these children are more likely to take on a Singaporean identity and therefore may have a different relationship with Singapore English than the expat children that we've looked at so far. We're also conducting discourse analysis of children's ideologies regarding accent and identity. All right, I'd like to thank all of the children and families and student researchers who have been involved in this work, and I'm happy to open things up for questions now.
Very good, thanks, Rebecca. So now we are open for Q&A. That's we still have about 34 minutes left, so anyone can raise questions and then probably direct the questions to our speakers. raising hands, or I do not know how to raise hands by clicking. I think you should be able to do it. Or if you write in the chat, I will be able to read it. So either way, it's now open floor.
Well, I guess I have a question for Cher Leng. I'm always very interested to see the dialect romanization that we see on signs in Singapore. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts about how these conventions for romanization of dialects developed here, and if we can see any typical features that are distinctive in hawker center signs from other contexts in which this kind of romanization might be used.
Thanks, Rebecca, for the question. I have not looked into this, and the first thing that came to my mind is to compare it with those in Malaysia. Because in Malaysia, you also find food names or signs that show the spelling of Hokkien or Cantonese, but they are spelled differently. Yeah, so I think there is a convention that started, and then it just rolls on. People like, oh, this is how it's been done, so I do it this way as well. But then if you go over across the causeway, you find that they do it a bit differently. So you have to also pronounce it and recognize that, oh, they mean the same thing, but actually they're spelled differently. So this is an interesting question to look at. Yeah, I don't know whether I answered your question. I have a question for Nala. Nala, when it comes to Baba Malay, I'm very curious about this issue of religion. How do they negotiate that? Because, yeah.
Well, religion, it depends on where they are. So a lot of one of the reasons people said for why the Peranakans moved to Singapore, part of it, but this one is unattested to. I can't find records of actual people saying so, but this is hearsay, that when they moved here, a lot of them did not want to maintain their ancestral altars. At first, it was traditional worship. A lot of in Malacca, but a lot of them did not want to maintain their ancestral altars, and the ones who particularly who converted to Catholicism moved to Singapore. So it might explain for why a lot of Peranakans in Singapore that you see are Catholics. But also interestingly, I think Peranakans are very open to syncretism, or like a fusion of different things, because at the antique store or the antique house that I used to go to of Baba Peter Wee, the Katong Antique House when he was still alive, he is Catholic, practicing Catholic. But if you go in, he's placed a statue of the Virgin Mary on an altar that looks very much like a Chinese altar with the traditional tok wee and everything like that. So there is that idea that you could blend different elements, choose them as you like, and maintain it, because and do it in your very own unique, distinct way. So there's that as well. So even though a lot of them are practicing Catholics, during Chinese New Year, they put out, you know how some Peranakans would have to put up traditional altars for Chinese New Year if you are still observing traditional worship. Even the Catholic ones might put up some version of that. They would hang up the red chai key, and then that would be the chanap that they put on the altar tables, and they would use the tok wee with the pictures of the deities on it. So there's, of course, their own way of doing it. I'm not an expert by any means because I'm a linguist, but this is what I've observed. Yeah.
How about the Muslim part of Malay?
Oh, so interestingly, because it was observed by Tan Chi Bing in the 1970s when he was doing his dissertation. It wasn't observed; it was written in his dissertation that that it wasn't necessarily at that time when a lot of local women were marrying these Chinese men that the Chinese men had to convert. Conversion was never an issue. It was only later on that Muslim marriages meant that the spouse had to take on Islam as well. That became an issue. But for most part of it, because the Peranakan culture, identity, and all was formed in much earlier time, that this wasn't an issue at all. So no, we are not. The community itself is not Muslim. Yeah. So I think that's why in his he was the one who brought up this specific. Let's see. Let me check because I have time. Then I can do this kind of thing. Where are my slides? That's why I think this observation was very relevant. Okay, it's not actually on my slides. I thought it was. That's why the observation he brought up, actually, Tan Chi-Bing was the one who found Huang Zhong's travel journal, and he said it was very significant then that he thought that was important to state that Chinese in Malacca ate pork. So clearly not Muslim. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Nala, I have a question, if I
Yes,
may.
go ahead.
I thought I heard you say that the Peranakans in Penang do not speak Baba Malay. They speak Penang Hokkien in some form or other. But the Babas of Malacca and Singapore speak
yes, that's
Baba
right.
Malay. And I just wonder if you had a theory why there's this difference.
There are various theories put up by different people. One of them is that when the Peranakans from Malacca moved to Penang, there were already groups or communities of Chinese people who had settled down with their spouses. So they kind of provided a model for these families who came from Malacca to model themselves after. So they were already settled down, and they were speaking Hokkien. So this was yet another community distinct from the Peranakans who had settled down and who were already there and who spoke Hokkien themselves. So when the Peranakans moved there, perhaps that was what they emulated. They had a model on which to emulate themselves after. Whereas in Singapore, it was kind of different. There was no married community like that. In fact, in an early census report, it was stated that most of the married men, Chinese men, were those who came from Malacca because they were the ones who brought their families with them. Yeah. So this is just one of the many conjectures. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Any questions? We still have 17 minutes. So nice thing looking at the screen, you always know the time.
May I ask a question?
Go ahead, Melody.
Hi, I have a question for Nana because I'm also doing Creole studies. I remember you mentioned that Baba Malay in the kind of modern form is more kind of static, or you also mentioned something about standard. So I'm always curious about the standard of a language is always kind of created by some authority. And as for the Creole languages, is always no such kind of authority most of the time. So when you study language, what do you mean by a more standard variety of a Creole language versus something that is more towards one side of the continuum? Because you mentioned that some speakers, they may perform more like Hokkien, some may perform more like Malay. So how you define the standardness of Baba Malay, for example?
I guess I don't know when in the talk that you hear me use the word standard, because there are two different notions of standard over here. So one is the notion of what the standard language is in ecology, and that's Malay itself, right? So but then there's also the other standard that's decided on by the community itself. So this is the one that people talk about, or they use more and more in their revitalization classes, in the kind of material that they organize. But these ones are usually decided upon because they are highly in use. They are forms that people think are salient and relevant. So they are the ones that are written down and kind of registered in the minds of these people. So they are the ones that are taught and then continue to be propagated. But you're right, it's kind of it's a choice that people make. So it depends on what's the notion of standard you're talking about. Is it the other standard language in the environment, or is it the new standard that the community has decided upon that they want to propagate, for example? Yeah.
I think I was asking about the second type because I'm not sure exactly about the situation of Baba Malay in Singapore, and it's like because you just mentioned that probably some people like within the community, some speaker may have certain like commonly agreeing form or kind of like a norm to propagate a language or to talk about the language. But what if they don't even have this kind of like agreed norm? Because like the language that I'm studying in Taiwan is kind of like, I think people perform it in different way. And as long as they can kind of communicate, they're happy with that. So yeah, I'm always curious about what you mean by like a standard way to do it, because as linguists, we always want to try to find kind of like a way to describe the language. Yeah, that's probably
it's not something that I would necessarily prescribe, but it's something that community has found for itself to be useful when they want to do something like revitalization. Because if you want to revitalize a language and you want to write it down, for example, inadvertently you are choosing one form over another, perhaps to teach, especially in a Creole, because there are so many ways of doing something. For example, as you say, perhaps of the situation in Taiwan with Elan Creole, for example. So the same goes for the language in Singapore. Some people might say, the language in the classroom isn't what you speak at home, but inadvertently there are choices that have to be made about what's the form that you want to put down in dictionaries or write it down in your guidebooks or teach in class. Yeah, it's a double-edged sword. It's not an easy one. Yeah.
Thank you for this like very interesting talk about Baba Malay, the situation here, and also about the concept of continuum. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I can contribute one question. I have a few, but then about the names and dialect identity in Singapore. That's Leng. One of my favorite hawker centers is the Tekka Center. It was known as Tekka Center, and then the thing renovated, and then we have Zhujiao. And then now after 20 years, it gets renovated again, and the name switched back to Tekka. Of course, if you look at the Chinese characters, it's the same. Then if you look at Singapore, if you also look at the name of the people on this screen, you have this dialect thing. You also have this Pinyin romanization. Even if it's a Mandarin, it doesn't have to be Pinyin. It's the Pinyin is only later on, right? And then Nala Li L-E-E is probably traditional spelling. It would be somewhere L-I for many people, but not necessarily in Pinyin, right? If you spell it L-I, it doesn't have to be Pinyin. But now, of course, it would be Pinyin. And then the H probably is Hui, and then you probably is Mandarin and Pinyin now. So if you look at Tekka and if you look at B-sign Mandarin, Pinyin, and then if you look at Big San Ting, there's a B-sign Ting. B-sign Ting is the it no longer is a crematorium. It used to be probably, but Besanting remained Besanting, right? Because even though Besan is Cantonese and it remains so. So as we go on, how do you think that it's going to play out? Because you do have lots of issues, dialect issues, and so on. At the same time, most young Singaporeans don't speak the dialects. They have been effectively killed by Mandarin and English. So what do you say to that?
Yeah, thank you for this fascinating question. So each year when I teach my GE module on bridging East and West, I always ask students to find out about their own names, their parents' names, and their grandparents' names. And then they will see a progression or a digression in the sense that the grandparents will have authentic dialect spelling names, right? And then when it comes to their parents' generation, some of them will have Christian names when they become Catholics and stuff like that. But then among my students, like large percentage of them have a so-called Christian name. Yeah. And I've also seen a trend where some of them just do away with the Chinese names. Like for example, they are called Annie Yo. The Chinese will call Yang Annie, which means it's it just translate from the Annie to Annie, and they don't have any more other names. So like Nala will just have Nala instead of Nala Li Hui something, right? So this is a trend that's going on, and even for our Prime Minister, you will find that his name is Lee, but all his children's names are Li. Because during the 80s, that's when we have the Hanyu Pinyin coming in. And the government wanted to change all our names, to Hanyu Pinyin. There was a big hoo-ha, because let's say if you are Zhuang, you sing Zhuang, in Teochew is CHNG, Cheng. When you change into ZHUANG, they say my grandparents will jump up from their grave because they're no longer my grandchildren. So there was a big hoo-ha there, and that's where the tikka happened with the zhujiao. Okay, and you imagine taxi drivers, Indian taxi drivers, Malay taxi, they will not know what is zhujiao. They are so used to this whole thing called tikka. So that's why you see the names changing there. In the end, they have to come back to Yue Ding Su Cheng, something that everybody recognizes to make it work for the environment. But for people's names, you will see a great reduction of dialect spelling. So among my students now, when I was in my primary school, I had to remember 14 names being a monitor. So it trained me to know this is a Hakka person, this is a Hainanese person. That was fascinating. But now I only have the last name to work on. So if I have the last name to work on, I have very little to work on. So some are very clear, like is the CHONG, I know it's a Hakka person. All right. But if you have a Li, I can't tell anymore, unless I have the other names that come. But then the first names are all pinyin. So because they are pinyin, it doesn't tell me very much about the dialect as well. Okay, so I find that among my students, those people who want to keep the dialect speaking mostly are the Cantonese. So that's very interesting. Yeah. I thought that's a fascinating thing that's going on. And so in time to come, you will find there are more Christian names coming up, there are more pinyin names, but they tend to keep their last name intact. But among our colleagues, we also have people like Jian Li, okay, Jian Li, who changed his whole name into Hanyu Pinyin as well. So you can't tell anymore whether he's a Singaporean or he's actually from China. Yeah. So I'm looking at Ka Chong Lai's name and I'm kind of fascinated. Ka Chong, is this the Cantonese or is this a Hakka?
It's the Cantonese.
Cantonese, yeah. So it's very clear. You see his name, Ka Chong, Jia Qiang or something, or Jia Chang or something. So, once you look at the name, you can tell straight away, right? Unlike the rest, like Adriel Tan, I can't tell. I just know that Adriel Tan is not Cantonese because Cantonese would be Chan. Okay, so there's a lot of fun doing this. Thanks.
I just wanted to mention that in my research with VA, we also found that same effect of Cantonese, where many more Cantonese background people who responded to our survey, they reported that they view Cantonese as their true mother tongue, and they would have preferred to have studied Cantonese in school as their MT rather than Mandarin. But when we look at Hokkien background people, we don't see that attitude at all. So there is a big gap there. Yeah. It's also interesting, as you mentioned, although a lot of young people who are NUS undergraduate age, they do have the pinyin spelling, but there are also quite a few who still have dialect spelling. And it's quite interesting to look into the rationale for that. When I've asked some of my students, sometimes it's because they have a generation character in their name that is shared with older cousins. And so that's why the parents felt it would be good to keep the dialect spelling. Yeah, but I think it would be quite interesting to look into what parents' reasoning is for continuing to give their children dialect spelling names.
I think it is. Actually, if you look at my name, right, if you know how I spell the Chinese portion of Hui Ying, right, it's in Han Yu Ping, but not my last name. So you notice that because my mom was convinced that this was going to be a fad that would pass quickly. So she did not buy into the fad to give me LI, but she did most probably wasn't actually she didn't actually learn Chinese in school. So it wasn't congruent across the board. But so that's what happened. So there were people who decided that this was a fad, it wasn't going to last. So might as well, stick to your home, your kind of ancestral name and continue from there as well. So there are a few people I know in that camp as well.
Yeah, I also want to mention that quite a few students who I've asked, although they appear to have pinyin names, actually their Chinese name is not pronounced in Mandarin with that pinyin, because the grandparents are dialect speaking, they chose the name and they chose the pinyin, but they didn't actually check what is the actual Mandarin pinyin for this name. So sometimes they just have a completely random pinyin name that appears to be pinyin, but it's not actually Mandarin.
Yeah, so among speakers here, our attendees here, I like to point to the name of Heng Noi Lo. That is so clearly a Teochew name. It's something Lian. So if you are out there, tell me if I'm wrong. Okay, I think I'm correct. So that's very traditionally pronounced as a Noi, although it, in Han Yu Ping, we'll say Lian, a Lian, but actually it's
Heng
very,
Huang.
now Heng Noi Lo.
Heng, what's the character for Heng?
Heng, I think it could be Xing. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about Heng. Yeah.
If it's Teochew, it probably would not be Xing.
Yeah, so I don't.
Cantonese, it would be Xing.
Okay.
I don't know. Well, okay, I'll check.
Yeah. I have one comment for Rebecca. Rebecca, the research that you're doing about this deletion thing sounds like something really important to put into schools in terms of acquisition, because this is something that's, if we can put into that, it can make them sound more, pronounce it correctly, because this deletion is so prevalent. I'm not sure whether this has gone into acquisition or teaching. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, well, given that speakers have a much lower rate of deletion when reading aloud, we can see that most students are aware that this is a standard feature. They know the TD should be there in standard pronunciation. So it's not really an issue of them not being aware. But this is a very prevalent feature of Singapore English, and I think it's unlikely that it's going to be going away anytime soon.
But Rebecca, you talk about being born is really birthplace doesn't play a role, but it's not really birthplace. It's probably whether the child went to kindergarten and interact with local people, local children. One of my neighbors, I don't know where they come from, but then probably they were Spanish when they were not English speaking. But the boy, I think it's about 4 or 5 years old. So I overheard him talking with the parents in the lift. He sounded like a local boy. Very similar. So I asked the parents whether she went to local kindergarten or not. And he did. I don't know where he was born, but then he sounded in Singlish.
So I think it's likely that there's a U-shaped pattern here. My 2 boys attended local preschool with all local kids, and they started to become very bi-dialectal, where they could speak very natural sounding Singapore English.
Right.
But at that time when they were acquiring this, I don't think they had an awareness, or I know they didn't have an awareness that they're not perceived as being Singaporean. Once they get older, which is the age range that we were looking at in the study, right? They become aware that other children find it strange to see, a white child speaking with Singapore English, and they'll stop using the features because they've always been bi-dialectal. They can do both, and then they avoid using Singapore English. And I've seen that happen with both of my boys. Yeah. So it's very interesting. I would like to look at a younger age range to see this process happening.
Well, what made people aware of that?
Well, children.
I mean, you see your boys that they are aware that they are speaking Singlish. Probably in my own recollection, when I speak to my parents, like any time, it was be Shanghai dialect because they it wouldn't be even conscious choice, right?
Well, I mean, in sociolinguistic work on children's development, we find that children develop a very sophisticated understanding of what language or what style to use in different situations with different people. So children develop that understanding, and they develop it, at slightly individual rates. Some children might be faster at it or slower. But what we see among these children, so for example, as I mentioned, the children growing up here have a very good, sophisticated understanding of non-local dialects of English. So they can identify various dialects very accurately. But it just depends on what kinds of national identities children become aware of at a young age. So for example, when we look at Singaporean children, what we find is the first type of English accent they can identify is China accented English. They can actually, they can identify who is from China before they can identify who's from Singapore. So that's the first accent that they become aware of, which makes a lot of sense because that's a large group here in Singapore that parents might point out to them, right? Or that they might hear about, oh, these people are from China.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Melody, you have a stupid question. So do you want to raise yours?
I think it's Daniel who has a question.
Yeah.
Melody?
And maybe Daniel come first because he raised his hand for a while.
Who?
Daniel.
Okay,
Daniel.
I thought he's okay. Yeah, Daniel, go ahead. Oh, we lost him probably. But yeah, Melody, why don't you? Your chat is earlier than Daniel's.
Oh, it was just a stupid question that because you guys were talking about spelling names in Singapore, but I'm from Hong Kong, so probably we have kind of like a different system. And I was just wondering, but probably answered that it was decided by parents here in Singapore. But if I remember correctly from my father, their names were kind of like transcribed by the government official back then, because most of them don't know like English. So it was just like they read their name in Chinese to those government officer, and then they try to transcribe that. So the interesting things happen is like, because when you look at my surname, which is Li, L-I, same as my father, but my uncle, so blood Leng father, bordered it with my 大伯 actually have the spelling L-E-E, because they were spelled by different government officials that they just randomly hear, the Li surname, so they just spell it differently. So that's why in Hong Kong, we don't really have kind of like a standardized way to do it. And usually, of course, the children would have the same last name as the parents, but actually with the same generation where you can have different spelling because of that. So I'm just curious what happened like in Singapore.
The government officials play a large role.
Yeah.
You know, I'm now considered English educated because when I arrived in Singapore first time, they asked me on the form, there's a question, are you English educated or Chinese educated? I said, I'm Chinese educated because I'm educated in China. Then she looked at me and said, no, you're English educated. So she took English educated. Now I am English educated. So that plays a large role. Okay, any response to Melody's? I think it's also random. Only the pinyin is only late, rather late. But in the early days, the 19th century, is the officials, and here you say something, ang, so A-N-G, or ang, O-N-G. It doesn't really, but then the name has its own significance, right? I'd better stop. Daniel. Daniel?
It looks like you can see Daniel's question in the chat. Yes?
So I got to read the question. Okay, I thought that he is there. He's online. No? Daniel, do you want to read your own question?
Yes, of course, I read my question.
Go ahead.
For the well-known Chinese song, The Moon Is My Heart, after once hearing it being sung in Malay during 2015 Peranakan Festival, would it be possible to sing it in English, Tamil, and dialects as well? If so, would it be possible that Christmas carols in church and in private gatherings be sung in Chinese language, dialects, as well as Tamil and other language? And for this Chinese New Year, would it be possible that some of the Chinese New Year songs be sung in dialects as well?
I guess I will just say you can feel free to sing a song in any language or dialect that you want. I know personally, I know that in Malaysia and Singapore, they always make these compilations of Chinese New Year songs sung by these girl groups. So I know there's one compilation by M Girls where they sing some Cantonese Chinese New Year songs as well as Mandarin New Year songs. So that is already happening. Yes.
Okay, thank you, and no further questions.
Okay, we now still have 5 minutes, but any more questions?
Sorry, I'm kind of curious about Cindy's name. This LI will put you right into the tradition of mainland China, you know. What's the situation like? How did it change from LEE to LI?
I think they kind of do it randomly because like I said, my father is LI and he's born and raised in Hong Kong. He's a pure Hong Kongese. But his brother, 我的大伯, is LEE. So the entire family of my cousin is spelled with LEE. So when I was young, I was always like, why are we spelled differently? Are we supposed to be the same family? And then when I grow older, my parents just told me, oh, it was because their name was transcribed by those government officials. And I think in Hong Kong, the LEE spelling is kind of like majority, but majority in a sense kind of like 70 or 60%, not in like 90, because I see more people with the LI spelling. But for example, when I was in primary school, I think I was the only 1 or 2 in my class that is spelled out by LI and the majority with LEE. Yeah. But I also have an interesting case that I know someone from Hong Kong who is also studying in NUS now. He got a purely pinyin spelling name. That's why I first recognized him as someone from mainland China. But then later on, when we mingle, I realized that he's actually pure from Hong Kong. And he said, oh, it was decided by my father. So among his generation, his name is the one who completely spelled in Mandarin pinyin. But the other sibling spelled kind of like the Cantonese way or kind of like the conventional way, but not entirely pinyin. So it was quite an interesting case in Hong Kong that probably we now have more, I don't know, we used to have more variety. I don't know, is it the right term to say? But these days, some parents also, like Nana's case, some people decided to use the pinyin, like the Huiyin. Yeah, but I decided to keep the first last name. I don't know.
Well, Singapore has a Hong Kong Guo He Nian. It's very, the owner of the what is the Shangri-La Hotel. Has a branch here in Singapore. The Tu Guo had not pinyin, the local dialect, but the spelling is different. Guo He Nian, and then there's the Guo family in Singapore and the Guo family in Malaysia and in Hong Kong. Yeah, well, the Guo He Nian is Malaysian back then. But anyway, we are now close to 11:50 now. I think that we probably should stop here. Let me thank the 3 panelists, Leng, well, that's Mandarin, not Teochew. I don't know how to do your Teochew name, and Nala and Rebecca. Thank you very much. It's a fun panel.